Since this series is about bridging the gap between your traditional drawing skills and your ability to draw whatever you want from your imagination, I'll just say this right now. Perspective is part of it. It's unavoidable. If we were in a math class right now and you were making a graph, it's like deciding that you don't need the x-axis or the y-axis or any of the units at all. Well, what are you left with? Something floating in space. And that's exactly what I see when I look at a lot of beginners' artwork. Also, if you haven't already seen it, there's an entire 2-part series in the store that's devoted to this topic. And that's going to focus more on the technique part. So I'll be addressing the subject from a different angle in this series. Now, I highly recommend watching that series because it is going to be the quickest way to improve your overall drawing skills. So what is perspective? Well, I'll say one thing, it's not a tool for drawing street corners and railroad tracks. Instead, it's the glue that holds all images together, any kind of image. So whether you're incredibly tight and analytical about it, or you're just following it sort of loosely, linear perspective is what tells the viewer how your objects relate to one another in space. At its core, it's a study of what do parallel lines do when they recede into the distance. And as you can see here, they don't stay parallel. If you can wrap your head around that single rule to figure out what parallel lines will do in different types of perspective, then you are going to immediately start to improve your drawings. In the perspective sketching series, I talk a lot about drawing on top of a perspective grid. And that's because it's sort of like a quick shortcut to envisioning three-dimensional space. Well, when you look at an actual still life, there's no grid. So what do the two have in common with one another? Well, that's where we're going to begin to change our mindset. I'm not going to go into the specifics of how to create a perspective grid because it's out of the scope of this series. But for now, let's just think of it as parallel lines extending beyond their endpoints. If you do this with a number of objects, you'll begin to get a framework. And then once you have this framework, you can begin to add your own objects into the same 3D space and you won't break the overall illusion. This is huge. So instead of randomly guessing how you're going to relate your objects to one another, the perspective grid gives you a set of repeatable rules to follow. But we're starting to get ahead of ourselves here. That's when you're drawing from your imagination and we're not there yet. So before that, we need to start changing the way that you just see the world. Remember how we changed from thinking about shape into thinking about form for simple objects? Well, this is going to be a very similar exercise. Now I'm going to tell you to envision a perspective grid when you look at the real world. So for instance, here's a picture of a window in my house. You could think of this as a rectangle, or you could think of it as the basis of a perspective grid. So just extend in your mind the major parallel lines of the window, and the perspective grid just begins to reveal itself. Sure, this is a relatively abstract thing to do, and it's going to take some time to wrap your head around it. But once you start to think this way, it will blow the doors off your drawings. So once again, we're going to forget drawing from imagination for just a second, and let's look at a still life drawing. If I were to draw a scene like this one with multiple objects, it's easy to mess up a key point, and that is where the objects connect to the ground. Sometimes it can just seem like something's floating, or that you haven't drawn all the objects on the same ground plane, and it looks a little sloppy, kind of confusing. Well, once you can envision the ground plane as part of a perspective grid, again, this is imaginary, then you have a better way of testing whether or not your objects are actually sitting on the same ground plane. And I'd say in the beginning, it's a great idea to actually draw these construction lines right on your paper. This is just another extension of the draw-through technique that we talked about in the form chapter. You're drawing lines that aren't actually real, but they'll help you construct the scene based on some general rules of thumb. And if you want, when you're done, you can erase these lines. But the beautiful thing about this sort of construction line is that if I take away the reference, I'm not out of luck. Now I can combine my knowledge of form, which is simple shapes in space, with a new understanding of the perspective grid and add objects to this still life. So here I can extend the grid a bit and add a footprint for a new object. And once I've got its footprint in my scene, I can turn that into a box form And once it's a box form, we're fast on track to constructing an actual detailed object. This is, once again, drawing from what I know, not just what I see. This is amazing. Form and space are related. They both have repeatable rules to follow. You're not just guessing how to place an object next to one another, you're constructing them in an imaginary 3D space. So you can see that the draw-through technique that we talked about in the last video is really inseparable from the idea of linear perspective. It's this grid that allows you to make geometric forms in 3D space. And without it, you might have some serious problems getting everything lined up. But once you begin to see these perspective grids wherever you look, then you can start adding your own 3D forms to any image you want. So when it comes to taking what you already know and translating it into a drawing from your imagination, I think it's all about this grid. It's a great way, for instance, to check the accuracy of your ellipses. Because if you remember, we talked about parallel lines diverging as they get further away from a vanishing point, or converging towards one another as they approach a vanishing point. Well, that means they just sort of get narrower as they get further away from you. Well, what this does is it creates a rule of thumb for cylinders. If something is near the vanishing point, it's going to be more squished vertically. If something's far away from the vanishing point, it's going to be more extended. And this is called the degree of an ellipse. So if you were to draw a soda can, probably the top would have a narrower degree than the bottom. And this is just a general rule of thumb that you know by understanding linear perspective. And again, I'm not going to get into all the rules here. That's really what my perspective series is all about. But this is great, because what this means is I have a simple trick that I can follow, and generally speaking, it'll give me some good accuracy. So that means that if I'm drawing cylindrical forms, I can use this rule of thumb. It doesn't matter if I'm working from my imagination or if I'm looking at an actual cylinder, I can use this little rule to check my accuracy. And for instance, if the top has a wider degree than the bottom, I'll know that something's wrong. And eventually, you're going to work more and more on this concept, and it becomes sort of internalized. And at that point, you don't necessarily even need to draw a grid anymore. So hopefully you can see the dual importance of form and perspective. The two are really inseparable, and in my opinion, these two are the best way for novices to improve their drawing, whether it's from observation or whether they want to work more imaginary.